One Halloween, I volunteered to work at a haunted house attraction with a few friends. The event was hosted in an old, abandoned building on the edge of town. The building had been vacant for years and was rumored to have its own haunted history, which made it the perfect setting for a Halloween event. We were given costumes and roles to play, and the place was transformed into a dark, winding maze filled with creepy rooms, flickering lights, and plenty of jump scares. My job was to stand at the end of a long, narrow hallway and jump out to scare people as they came through. I wore a tattered costume and a mask that covered my face, hiding in the shadows, waiting for each group to pass. It was fun watching people's reactions, hearing them scream and laugh as they stumbled through the haunted house. The night was going smoothly, and I was having a great time until close to midnight, when things took a darker turn. It was nearing the end of the night and the crowds had started to thin. I was getting ready to wrap up when I noticed a man standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He wasn't in costume like the rest of the visitors, just dressed in a black hoodie and jeans, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I thought maybe he was waiting for his friends or just trying to figure out where to go, so I didn't pay much attention to him at first. After a few minutes, I realized he hadn't moved at all. I waved, hoping he'd say something, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring, his face hidden in the shadows, his posture unnaturally stiff. A strange feeling crept over me as I continued to watch him, and I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I glanced around, hoping to see one of the other staff members, but I was alone in that section of the haunted house. I decided to break character and walk down the hallway to get closer, asking him if he needed help finding the exit. He remained silent, standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me. His gaze was cold and intense, and I could feel it boring into me. I backed away, suddenly realizing that he might not be part of the attraction at all. I hurried back to the main area and found one of the other staff members, explaining that there was a man lingering at the end of the hallway. We went back together, but by the time we reached the hallway, he was gone. We searched the area, thinking he might have wandered into one of the rooms, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished. We shrugged it off, assuming he must have found the exit, but the uneasy feeling lingered. After we closed for the night, I was walking to my car in the nearly deserted parking lot when I saw him again. He was standing by the exit of the haunted house, just watching me. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, fumbling for my car keys. As I unlocked the door, he began to walk toward me, a faint smile spreading across his face. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could, looking in the rearview mirror to make sure he wasn't following me. I never went back to that haunted house again, and I never figured out who he was or what he wanted. But every Halloween, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to appear once more. The memory of his cold, unblinking stare still sends a chill down my spine, a reminder that some horrors are all too real. Back in college, I worked part-time at a convenience store that stayed open until midnight. On Halloween, I was scheduled to work the night shift, so I wore a simple costume, a witch hat and some fake fangs, to get into the spirit. The evening was mostly quiet, with only a few customers stopping by for last-minute candy or Halloween party supplies. I spent most of the shift restocking shelves and cleaning up after the trick-or-treaters who had left candy wrappers around the store. Around 11 p.m., just as I was beginning to think I'd be closing alone, a man walked into the store. He was dressed as a clown, with a bright red wig, painted face, and a large, exaggerated smile on his mask. At first, I thought he was just another Halloween enthusiast, but as he moved through the aisles, I noticed he wasn't picking anything up. He just wandered slowly, his movements deliberate and unsettling. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my tasks, but every time I glanced his way, I caught him staring at me, his head tilted slightly to the side. His mask hid his expression, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. I went back to the counter, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But instead, he approached, standing silently on the other side of the counter, not saying a word. Finally, he spoke, his voice muffled and strange through the mask. He asked if I was alone, his tone too casual, as if he already knew the answer. I lied, saying that my manager was in the back, and he fell silent again, just staring. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tried to keep my composure. I didn't want to show him how nervous I was, so I pretended to check something on the register, hoping he would get bored and leave. After a few minutes, he finally walked out. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was over, but then I saw him through the store window. He was standing outside watching me again, his face half lit by the streetlight. He didn't move, just stood there, his eyes fixed on me through the glass. I tried to ignore him, but every time I looked up, he was still there, his mask grinning back at me. I called my coworker, who was scheduled to relieve me soon, asking if he could come a little early. When he arrived, the clown was gone, but the unease lingered. I locked up and walked to my car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I got home, I found a small package on my doorstep wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a single white glove and a note that read, "I'll see you next year." I don't know how he found out where I lived, but I never worked Halloween night at that store again. Every Halloween, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that clown mask grinning back at me from the shadows. When I was around 12, my family lived in a house that backed onto a large wooded area. The woods were dense and dark, and my parents always told me not to go too far in, especially after sunset. On Halloween night, after a long evening of trick-or-treating, I went to bed, exhausted but happy. My parents stayed up a little later, talking quietly in the living room as I drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate tapping, like someone was knocking on the glass. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked out the window. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark outline of the trees. But then a figure stepped into view, partially illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. It was a man, standing just a few feet away from my window, staring directly at me. He wore a long, dark coat that hung loosely from his shoulders, and his face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight. He had an unsettling expression, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open as if he was whispering something I couldn't hear. I felt frozen in place, unable to look away as he raised his hand and tapped on the window again, this time a little harder. I stumbled out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to my parents' room. I shook them awake, my voice barely more than a whisper as I tried to explain what I had seen. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check, but by the time he got there, the man was gone. We searched the yard, but there was no sign of him. No footprints or disturbed grass, nothing that could prove he had been there at all. For weeks afterward, I was terrified to sleep in my room, constantly feeling like someone was watching me from the shadows outside. I kept my curtains closed, but every night I'd wake up, convinced I could hear that faint tapping on the glass. My parents reassured me, telling me it was just a bad dream, but I knew what I had seen. That man had been real, and he had been watching me. Even now, years later, I still get chills when I think about that Halloween night. I often wonder if he was a random stranger passing through, or if he had been watching our house, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. Every Halloween, I find myself looking out my window, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me, a reminder of the fear that still lingers from that night. A few Halloweens ago, I was working late at a call center in a quiet office building on the edge of town. The area was mostly empty at night, with just a few businesses open during the day. My shift ended around 10 p.m., and as usual, I was one of the last people to leave. I gathered my things, shut down my computer, and began the long walk down the empty corridor to the exit. As I reached the elevator, I noticed a man standing by the door. He was wearing a long coat and had his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. I hadn't seen him before, and he didn't seem like someone who worked in the building. I pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, he stepped in without a word. I was about to follow, but something made me hesitate. I told him I'd wait for the next one, and he gave a slight nod, staring at me for a second before the doors closed. I took the stairs, feeling uneasy. As I descended, I kept hearing faint footsteps echoing in the stairwell, but every time I stopped, the sound would disappear. I finally reached the ground floor, walked quickly to my car, and breathed a sigh of relief as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the man again, standing just outside the entrance, staring after me. He was perfectly still, his hands still in his pockets, his face half hidden in shadow. I sped away, the uneasy feeling lingering long after I reached home. The next day I mentioned it to a coworker, who told me that a similar-looking man had been spotted around the building before. No one knew who he was or what he wanted, but there were rumors that he was stalking the area, watching people leave at night. That Halloween, I made sure to leave with others, and I haven't stayed late since. Last Halloween, my friend Sarah and I decided to check out an abandoned house in our neighborhood that had been empty for as long as I could remember. It was an old Victorian-style home, with peeling paint and broken windows, surrounded by overgrown bushes and trees. Local kids called it the Witch House because of its eerie appearance, but no one knew its actual history. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the house casting long shadows across the lawn. We made our way inside using our phone flashlights to navigate the dark, dusty rooms. The place was completely empty, with graffiti on the walls and broken furniture scattered around. As we moved through the house, we heard a creak from the floor above us. We froze, listening, but the sound stopped. We figured it was just the house settling and continued our exploration. But as we reached the staircase, we heard the creak again, this time followed by faint footsteps. They sounded deliberate, as if someone were pacing slowly. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the better of us, so we carefully climbed the stairs, trying to stay quiet. At the top, we found a long hallway with several doors. One of the doors was slightly open, and inside we could see a figure standing by the window, staring out into the night. It was a man wearing tattered clothes, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't seem to notice us, but as we tried to back away, the floor creaked under our feet. He turned slowly, revealing a face that looked worn and haggard, his eyes sunken and dark. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until we reached the street. When we looked back, we saw him standing at the window, watching us. We never returned to that house, and every time I pass it, I feel his eyes on me, as if he's waiting for us to come back. One Halloween night, I stayed late at the school where I worked as a janitor. The building was old, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways that took on an eerie quality after dark. I had volunteered to lock up after the school's Halloween party, so I was the last one there, cleaning up the decorations and shutting off the lights. As I made my way down the main hallway, I noticed a shadow pass across the end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I heard faint footsteps, followed by a soft whisper. I called out, thinking someone had stayed behind, but there was no response. I continued my work, feeling uneasy. As I entered the gymnasium to turn off the last set of lights, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. It looked like a young boy, but his posture was strange. He was hunched over, his head tilted to the side as if listening. I approached, calling out to him, but he didn't move. I was just a few feet away when he suddenly turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. I searched the entire school, convinced it was a prank, but I found no one. When I finally left, locking the doors behind me, I glanced back and saw him again, standing in the gym window, watching me. The next day, I learned that years ago, a boy had gone missing at the school and was never found. I don't know if it was him that I saw, but I never stayed late on Halloween again. A few years back, my girlfriend and I decided to take a road trip for Halloween, exploring some small towns and stopping at local attractions. We ended up in a town that seemed to be stuck in time, with old, run-down buildings and hardly anyone on the streets. We found a motel to stay the night, a cheap, shabby place with faded signs and peeling paint. That evening, as we were getting ready to go out, we heard a knock on the door. We weren't expecting anyone, so we ignored it, assuming it was a mistake. But the knocking continued, slow and rhythmic, almost as if someone were tapping a pattern. My girlfriend opened the door a crack, but no one was there. We laughed it off as a Halloween prank and went out for dinner. When we returned, we found a note slipped under the door. It was a single sheet of paper with the words, "I saw you," scrawled in messy handwriting. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just some kids trying to scare the tourists. But as the night went on, we heard more strange noises, like soft scratching at the window and footsteps just outside. In the morning, we found another note on the car windshield. This one read, "I know where you're going." We left the motel as quickly as we could, and as we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a man standing by our door, watching us with a twisted smile. We haven't been back to that town since, and every Halloween, I wonder if he's still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. One Halloween night, I decided to go for a late walk to clear my head. The streets were mostly empty, with only a few stragglers left from the night's festivities. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children. I made my way through the neighborhood, enjoying the quiet, until I reached the edge of a nearby park. As I passed the park, I noticed a figure sitting on a bench, hunched over with their face in their hands. I assumed it was someone who'd had too much to drink, but as I walked closer, they looked up at me, their face pale and expressionless. Something about their eyes felt wrong, almost hollow, as if they were looking through me. I kept walking, feeling a chill run down my spine. But as I moved past the bench, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and measured, matching my pace. I quickened my step, and the footsteps grew louder. I glanced back and saw the figure standing, watching me, their head tilted to the side. I began to run, my heart pounding, and when I reached my street, I turned to see if they were still following me. They were gone, but as I reached my front door, I noticed a small piece of paper on the ground. It was a torn scrap with a single word written in red ink: "Run." I checked the park the next day, but the bench was empty, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. I still wonder who or what I encountered that night, and every time I walk by that park, I feel a strange sense of dread, as if they might be waiting, watching, ready to follow me again.